Welcome to the debate. A billionaire and a homeless man walk into a first-century religious gathering.
Sounds like the setup to a joke, honestly.
Right? But the punchline is brutal. The billionaire is immediately ushered to the VIP seating, and the homeless man is told to stand in the corner or just sit on the floor down by the speaker's feet.
Which, from the outside, it sounds like a simple, albeit harsh, social faux pas.
Exactly. But today we're looking at why the writer of James treats this specific seating arrangement as a catastrophic, basically fatal collapse of the Christian faith.
It really is one of the most striking scenes in all of ancient literature. We're examining James chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, because we are essentially building the framework for a comprehensive study module on this text. And it's a passage that uniquely merges deep theological claims about the nature of Christ with, razor-sharp social ethics.
And that intersection brings us to the central diagnostic question of our discourse today. When we look at this crisis James is addressing, what is the fundamental root of the disease?
Right, the core issue.
Yeah. Is James primarily diagnosing a theological and Christological failure, meaning a blindness to the true divine glory of Christ? Or is he primarily attacking a structural socio-political corruption of early church governance?
And the stakes on how we answer that are incredibly high for how we apply the text today, especially when we're drafting application questions for modern learners.
Exactly. So I will be arguing that this text is fundamentally a Christological treatise. The social sins of partiality that James describes are terrible, yes, but they're merely symptoms. The actual disease is a divided mind and a profound failure to revere Jesus as the Lord of glory.
And I will be arguing that viewing this primarily as a theological wavering severely blunts James's radical, immediate social critique. I believe the emphasis must be placed on the literal, structural environment of this event.
The actual room they're in?
Yes, exactly. The early Christian gathering space here was a judicial arena where Roman social rank was actively allowed to infiltrate and oppress the vulnerable. It's a crisis of ecclesiological governance and systemic injustice, not just, bad thoughts during worship.
Well, let's put our cards on the table. My perspective is anchored in the very opening verse, where James establishes the ultimate measuring stick for human behavior. He says you cannot hold faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ while showing partiality.
Which is a heavy demand.
It is. And the phrase he uses for Christ there is staggering. He calls him the Lord of Glory, or Kyrios Testoxis. This isn't just a polite title. For a first-century Jewish writer, glory points directly to the Shekinah.
The blinding, visible presence of God.
Exactly. The presence that historically dwelt in the temple. And A.T. Robertson actually points out that this is an objective genitive, meaning Jesus isn't just glorious. He is the literal embodiment, the object of the glory itself. So, when these believers engage in partiality—
The term prosopolepsia, right?
Yes, prosopolepsia, which literally means accepting the face or judging by surface appearance. When they do that, they are committing a direct act of idolatry.
How so? Idolatry seems like a strong word for bad hospitality.
Because they are looking at the exterior material wealth of a human being and falsely equating that earthly wealth with divine glory. The root of this behavior is a divided mind. It's cognitive dissonance. If you truly comprehend the blinding Shekinah glory of Christ, the gold ring of a Roman aristocrat should look, frankly, entirely dim to you.
I see the theological weight you're emphasizing, but I come at it from a completely different angle. If we just frame this as an internal spiritual failure, we miss the brutal political reality of the words James deliberately selects for this module. Let's look at the setting.
Okay.
James doesn't use the standard Christian word for church here. He doesn't use ecclesia. He uses the word synagogue.
Which is a fascinating linguistic choice, I'll admit.
It changes everything about the scene. And A.T. Robertson actually points to inscription evidence showing that early Jewish Christian gatherings literally used the term synagogue for their buildings. And historically, the synagogue wasn't just a place where people sang hymns and listened to a sermon.
Right, it had civic functions.
Exactly. It functioned as a judicial setting, where community arbitrations, civil disputes, and legal matters were handled. So the crisis James is addressing isn't just about the usher giving the best seat to a wealthy visitor during a Sunday service. It is about the wealthy actively corrupting the justice system of the community.
So you see it as rigging the courtroom.
Absolutely. Jewish legal tradition, like what we see later codified by Maimonides, explicitly required that in any legal or governance assembly, the rich and the poor had to be treated with absolute parity. Judges were strictly forbidden from letting a wealthy man sit while forcing a poor man to stand.
To prevent bias.
Yes, precisely. So the optics of social dominance wouldn't unconsciously sway the legal arbitration. By using the word synagogue, James is sounding an alarm. The Christian community was failing a standard of baseline justice that the Jewish synagogue already upheld. The sin here is the structural rigging of a judicial space.
I hear that. And the historical function of the synagogue is undeniable. But if this is entirely about the Roman legal system and structural governance, how do you explain what James does next? Because he doesn't just attack the legal outcome.
What do you mean?
Look at where he locates the rot in verse 4. After describing this terrible seating arrangement, James asks, "Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges of evil thoughts?" He points directly inward.
But those internal thoughts are immediately externalized.
They are, but the mechanism matters for our word study. The Greek word there relates to diakrino. It implies an action that is baked into their character, a chronic, ingrained division of loyalty. It's the exact same concept of the double-minded man tossed like a wave on the sea from chapter 1.
Right, the divided mind.
Yes. James is saying that their internal allegiance is split between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Rome. The disease isn't the seating chart. The disease is the divided heart that produces the seating chart.
I don't deny the internal component, but I think you're abstracting what those evil thoughts actually are. They aren't just abstract theological waverings about the nature of Christ. Those evil thoughts are the specific, unjust estimations of human worth driven by Roman societal programming.
Meaning they are sizing up human utility.
Exactly. It's like a modern corporate networking event where you're, constantly glancing at people's name badges to see their job title before you decide how much eye contact to give them. James is saying that internal calculus, that split-second sizing up of human utility and leverage, is the worldly disease.
That's a great modern parallel.
And you cannot separate that internal calculation from the structural harm it instantly produces, which brings us to the two men themselves in our historical profiles, because the physical manifestation of this judgment is where the text derives its incredible power.
It really is a striking, almost cinematic visual contrast. James presents two historical archetypes that serve as a stress test for the community. On one side, you have the gold-fingered man, the Chrysodoctylios.
Which is such a specific, vivid term.
It is. He is gleaming, adorned with the literal symbols of power. On the other side, you have the man in filthy clothing, the Rouparus. And the specific Greek word used for the poor man's clothing suggests garments that are deeply soiled from intense physical labor or sheer neglect. He is covered in the grime of the world.
And the community's reaction to him is visceral.
Right. And I believe James is using these two strangers as a mirror. If you recall the famous mirror concept from James chapter 1, where the Word of God shows us our true spiritual reflection, here in chapter 2, the marginalized stranger becomes the mirror.
Okay, I see where you're going.
How the community treats that labor-worn visitor reveals undeniably whether the church truly believes what they say about Jesus. It exposes their Christology.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's merely a theological mirror test. Framing it that way makes the vulnerable, poor man nothing more than a prop and a spiritual exercise for the privileged. Let's look at the actual physical consequence for this man in the filthy clothes.
Okay, fair enough.
The community tells him to stand over there or else sit down here under my footstool.
The phrasing is certainly harsh.
It's more than harsh. It is literal subjugation. If you look closely at the Greek phrasing for under my footstool, as Robertson points out, it is not about bad hospitality. It is the exact language of Old Testament conquest. Think of Deuteronomy or the book of Joshua, where the victorious commanders literally place their feet on the necks of the defeated kings.
Wow. Right. It's the posture of a conqueror.
Exactly. By telling the poor man to sit under the footstool of the wealthy man, the church is actively subjugating the vulnerable to honor their own oppressors.
That is incredibly dark imagery.
And it's historically accurate to who this rich man was. The gold-fingered man isn't just a guy with a successful business. I mean, he's a literal representative of the Roman equestrian class. These were the aristocrats who wore gold rings as a legally protected badge of their social rank.
The equites.
Yes, the knights, James explicitly calls this out a few verses later when he asks, "Is it not the rich who oppress you and drag you into court?" The language used for drag implies violent, forcible treatment. The church is handing the gavel to the very Roman class that is violently dragging them into the streets. That is a structural political crisis of the highest order.
I will grant you that the irony James points out is scathing. They are literally rolling out the red carpet for their own abusers. But let me push back on why they are submitting to these abusers, because it circles us right back to the theology.
How so?
The only reason a Christian community would hand the gavel to a Roman equestrian is if they have lost the theological framework of the divine reversal.
Ah, the inversion of the social pyramid.
Exactly. This is the synthesis of grace. Look at how James counters this crisis in verse 5. This is the turning point of the passage. He says, "Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom?"
It's a direct challenge to meritocracy.
It is the ultimate challenge to it. God's sovereign initiative explicitly bypasses the worldly measuring sticks. And to be clear, James isn't saying that God causes poverty or that material poverty inherently saves a person's soul.
Right, it's not a blanket romanticization of poverty.
No, not at all. What James is saying is that God's election consistently ignores the gold ring. God doesn't look at the networking badge. The divine reversal is the absolute theological cure to partiality. The poor are rich in faith because they have been stripped of the illusion of self-reliance.
They have nothing to rely on but the grace of God.
Yes. Therefore, to favor the wealthy equestrian over the poor laborer isn't just bad governance or a structural failure. It is a direct assault on the sovereign choices of God. It is to despise the very people God has chosen to honor.
That is a compelling argument for the underlying theology. But if we are building a study module to understand this text today, we have to ask how we actually apply this synthesis of grace in the modern world.
Okay, let's talk application.
If we agree on the divine reversal, we have to look at the strict structural application of it. So for our reflection questions, we need to ask, who is being told to sit on the floor in modern professional and social settings?
That's the uncomfortable question, isn't it?
It really is. Because we don't have Roman equestrians walking into our gatherings with gold rings anymore. But we absolutely have corporate boardrooms, elite professional networks, and meritocratic hierarchies.
Sure, the modern equivalents.
Right. Is the person being pushed to the footstool today the blue-collar worker coming into a white-collar congregation? Is it the socially awkward individual who doesn't possess the polished, charismatic networking skills of the executive class?
That's a great reflection question for the module.
Because if we only treat this passage as an abstract lesson about God's sovereignty, we risk nodding along to the theology on Sunday while continuing to ruthlessly curate our social networks to exclude the vulnerable on Monday. The early church imported Roman hierarchies into the synagogue. We import corporate meritocracy hierarchies into our spaces.
Which is precisely why James doesn't let them off the hook with just a theological nod. He forces the theology into action by invoking the royal law. And the way James explains the mechanics of this law is absolutely devastating to those modern hierarchies you just mentioned.
You're talking about the chain analogy.
Yes.
James quotes the book of Leviticus, "Love your neighbor as yourself." He calls this the royal law, the supreme law of the king. And he argues that this law is an indivisible unity. Think of it like a heavy chandelier hanging from the ceiling by a chain of 10 links.
Okay.
You don't have to take a hammer and shatter all 10 links to send that chandelier crashing to the floor. You only have to break one link. The whole structure fails.
Exactly. James says the law of love works exactly like that. If we love our family, if we donate to charity, if we sing the right hymns, but we snub the socially undesirable person who walks into our gathering, if we calculate their utility and decide they belong on the floor, the chain is broken. The entire royal law falls apart.
And James uses incredibly aggressive language to describe that failure. He doesn't say, "You made a minor mistake." He uses phrasing that translates to, "You are working a sin." It implies active, deliberate labor. You are manufacturing sin.
Because partiality is fundamentally incompatible with the image of God. If human worth comes solely from the Shekinah glory of Christ, then sizing up someone's economic output or their networking value isn't just a minor administrative oversight, it is a systemic failure to love.
Right. If you favor the major donor over the marginalized visitor, you have fundamentally misunderstood who Jesus is. That is why I insist the root of the crisis is Christological. I agree that the theological weight behind the royal law is massive. But look at the final warning James gives them. He warns them that they will be judged by the law of liberty, the gospel law of grace. And the terrifying reality of the law of grace is that it actually holds a higher standard of accountability than external behavioral laws.
Because to whom much is given, much is required.
Precisely. If a community has been liberated from the oppressive, crushing hierarchies of the Roman Empire through the blood of Christ, if they have been given the ultimate freedom, and they consciously choose to rebuild those exact same oppressive hierarchies inside the doors of their own community,
It's a betrayal of that freedom.
it is a profound, structural, and ecclesiological failure. They are taking the bricks of their own liberation and using them to rebuild the prison they were just rescued from. They are structurally enforcing the very oppression Christ died to dismantle.
That is a brilliant way to frame the tragedy of what's happening in that room. It really brings the gravity of the text into focus. Well, let's summarize our positions in light of this incredibly rich discussion.
Sounds good.
I maintain that the foundational issue in James 2:1-5 is Christological. It is a failure to recognize the true Shekinah glory of Christ, which inevitably leads to the idolatry of earthly wealth. When believers operate with cognitive dissonance, a divided mind, or diakrino, they falsely elevate the symbols of human power over the reality of divine grace. The social failure is the symptom. The wavering faith in the Lord of glory is the disease.
And I maintain that the driving force and immediate crisis of the text is structural and ecclesiological. James is addressing the tragic, active importation of Roman equestrian hierarchies into the Christian judicial space. This wasn't just a failure of internal thought. It was a political crisis that resulted in the literal judicial subjugation of the vulnerable, placing them under the footstool of their oppressors, and rebuilding the empire's power dynamics inside the church.
Yet, despite our different angles of approach, we find a remarkably strong point of convergence. Whether viewed through the lens of theology or sociology, we both agree that James views partiality, judging people by their exterior status, not as a minor character flaw or cultural blind spot, but as a catastrophic, fatal failure of the Christian faith.
Absolutely. It is a complete contradiction of the gospel. And I think this discourse highlights the immense value of studying the original linguistic and historical context of the text for this module. By understanding the mechanics of how the Roman rank operated, the crucodactylus, and the psychological mechanics of how partiality breaks the entire chain of the royal law, we bridge the gap between the first century world and our modern ethics.
It's incredibly relevant.
It forces us to ask how the law of liberty challenges our corporate boardrooms, our modern professional networks, and our own internal calculations of human worth today.
There really is so much more to explore in this material, especially for anyone developing a study module or looking to apply these ethics to real life. It challenges us to look closely at the architecture of our own lives.
Definitely.
When you look at how the marginalized are treated in your own community, or even in the quiet calculations of your own mind, is it just a superficial social habit, or is it a sign that the structural integrity of your faith is compromised? We will leave you to reflect on whether your own social habits reflect a theological or a structural blind spot.